They called him the Olive Oil King, but Joseph Profaci's empire was built on blood, not cooking oil. When he arrived in New York City from Sicily in 1921, America was deep in prohibition, and opportunity knocked for those willing to answer with violence. In September 1921, a young Sicilian named Joseph Profaci stepped off the boat in New York Harbor, carrying little more than his ambitions and memories of the old country. He had tried his luck in Chicago first, running bakeries and grocery stores, but none of them took root. Something pulled him back east to Brooklyn in 1925, where the real opportunities lay hidden in the shadows of prohibition. Brooklyn became his kingdom, and olive oil became his crown. Profaci built a legitimate importing business that would earn him the nickname the Olive Oil King. But everyone knew the real money didn't come from cooking ingredients. The bootlegging gang he formed in 1928 would become the foundation of something much larger, a criminal empire that would outlast him by decades. The streets of Brooklyn in the late 1920s were a battlefield. Different gangs carved up neighborhoods like medieval fiefdoms, each protecting their slice of the illegal alcohol trade that Prohibition had made so profitable. In the Bensonhurst, Dyker Heights, Bath Beach, Coney Island, Flatbush, and Williamsburg sections of Brooklyn, various underworld factions fought for supremacy. Men like Frankie Yale, Michael the Sweetheart Abbatemarco, and Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Perino waged war in the shadows. But their time was running out. On July 1, 1928, Frankie Yale was gunned down on the orders of Al Capone, who wanted control of the Unione Siciliana. Yale's murder created a power vacuum that Profaci and his brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco, eagerly filled. They gained control over Bensonhurst, Bay Ridge, Red Hook, and Carroll Gardens, while the rest of Yale's operations went to the Masseria family. But Profaci's rise to power wasn't just about being in the right place at the right time. He understood something fundamental about organized crime that many of his contemporaries missed. It needed structure, discipline, and above all, organization. The bloody Castellamarese War of 1930-31 would prove him right. The Colombo crime family emerged with the other four families at the end of the Castellamarese War, a mafia power struggle that left as many as 60 mobsters dead. It was a massacre that shocked even hardened criminals. The old ways of doing business, through vendettas and endless blood feuds, had nearly destroyed Italian-American organized crime. Something had to change. It was during Lucky Luciano's reorganization of the American Mafia after the war, following the assassinations of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, that Profaci's gang became officially recognized as the Profaci crime family. Luciano's vision was revolutionary. Instead of one boss ruling over all, there would be 5 families in New York, each with its own territory and operations, all governed by a commission that would settle disputes and keep the peace. The commission's purpose was to mediate disputes, serve as judges and executioners, and bring order to organized crime. The bosses of the 5 families were given permanent seats on the board, which helped enshrine them in a permanent place of power. For Profaci, this meant legitimacy and protection. His family might have been the smallest and youngest of the 5, but he had a seat at the table with equals. For nearly 3 decades, Profaci ruled his family without interruption or challenge. During his reign, the family was active in loan sharking, racketeering, and gambling. He ran his organization like a traditional Sicilian clan, demanding absolute loyalty and tribute from his soldiers. Every member kicked up to Profaci, and Profaci alone decided how the money was distributed. Profaci aligned himself closely with Joseph Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno family. This alliance would prove crucial in maintaining his power, but it also revealed something about Profaci's character. He was old school, a traditionalist who believed in the ancient codes of honor and respect that governed the Mafia in Sicily. But New York wasn't Sicily, and a new generation of mobsters was growing up on American streets with American ideas about fairness and opportunity. The cracks in Profaci's empire began to show in the 1950s. His top captains ran lucrative operations throughout Brooklyn, but Profaci's demands for tribute grew heavier with each passing year. He might have been the olive oil and tomato paste king of America, but he was hardly popular with some of the made men in the family. His requests for tribute infuriated soldiers who felt they were being squeezed too hard. Among the most successful of Profaci's crews was one run by three brothers from Red Hook, Larry, Albert, and Joseph Gallo. The Gallos had grown up in the life, sons of a Prohibition bootlegger who did little to discourage his boys from participating in local criminal activities. The youngest, Joseph, would earn many nicknames over the years, but history would remember him as Crazy Joe. Diagnosed with schizophrenia in his youth, Joe Gallo became an enforcer in the Profaci crime family and formed his own crew with his brothers. But there was nothing crazy about the way the Gallos ran their operations. They were innovative, aggressive, and most importantly, successful. Their territory generated significant income. But like water flowing downhill, most of it ended up in Profaci's pockets. The situation came to a head over a numbers runner named Frankie Schatz Abatamarco. Abatamarco ran an illegal policy game and began refusing to pay Profaci the monthly tribute he demanded. By the end of 1959, he owed Profaci more than $50,000. For a boss like Profaci, this wasn't just about money. It was about respect and the principle that nobody defied the family leadership. Profaci asked Joe Gallo to murder Abatamarco, promising to hand over the policy racket to Gallo in exchange for the hit. It seemed like a straightforward arrangement, the kind of deal that kept the machinery of organized crime running smoothly. But Profaci had miscalculated badly. What Profaci didn't know was that Gallo had been conspiring with Abatamarco to take down Profaci. The Gallos weren't just another crew content to kick up to an aging boss who contributed nothing to their operations. They represented a new generation of American mobsters who questioned why they should hand over their hard-earned money to someone just because he had been around longer. In November 1959, Abatamarco was shot and killed by two men. After a breakdown of communication, Profaci recalled the offer to hand over Abatamarco's racket to Gallo and thus started the First Colombo Family War. What began as a dispute over a numbers operation would escalate into something far more serious, a fundamental challenge to the way the Mafia had always done business. In 1961, the Gallo brothers made their boldest move yet. They kidnapped four of Profaci's top men, underboss Joseph Magliocco, Frank Profaci, Joe's brother, Captain Salvatore Musacchia, and soldier John Simone. This was a shocking move, as it violated the Mafia's code of silence and respect for hierarchy. The kidnapping wasn't just about random violence. The Gallos demanded a more favorable financial scheme for the hostages' release. After a few weeks of negotiation, Profaci and his consigliere, Charles the Sige Lo Cicero, made a deal with the Gallos and secured the peaceful release of the hostages. This incited the First Colombo War. What followed was a series of tit-for-tat murders that turned Brooklyn into a battlefield. The fallout from the initial violence laid the groundwork for civil war, ignited by the fearless Gallo brothers. The war claimed its victims on both sides. Joe Jelly Girelli, a Gallo enforcer, vanished in August 1961, with a dead fish wrapped in his clothes left on a Gallo hangout's doorstep to signify Joe Jelly sleeps with the fishes. In November 1961, Profaci soldiers, John Guerriglia and Paul Ricci, were gunned down in Ricci's Brooklyn headquarters by Gallo gunmen. But the most significant development came when Profaci reached out to one of his most ambitious young captains, Carmine Persico. Known as the Snake for his ability to slither out of tight spots, Persico had initially sided with the Gallos. Persico and Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio attempted to strangle Larry Gallo, but Larry survived when a police officer happened to walk into the bar. Although Persico had joined hands with the Gallo brothers against Profaci, his eventual betrayal led the Gallos to call him the Snake. As the gang war intensified, resulting in 9 murders and 3 disappearances, Gallo and his crew retreated to their fortified headquarters on President Street, which they called the Dormitory. The war might have continued indefinitely, but the law intervened. In 1961, Gallo was sentenced to 7 to 14 years imprisonment for conspiracy and extortion. On June 6, 1962, legendary godfather Joe Profaci died of liver cancer, passing the reins of his mob empire to his brother-in-law, Joe Magliocco. The old king was dead, but the succession wouldn't be smooth. Magliocco inherited not just a crime family, but also a war and a bitter alliance with the Bonanno family that would soon drag him into an even bigger conspiracy. In 1963, Joseph Bonanno made plans to assassinate several rivals on the Mafia commission, bosses Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and Stefano Magaddino. Bonanno sought Magliocco's support, and Magliocco readily agreed. Bitter over being denied a seat on the commission, Magliocco assigned the task of killing Lucchese and Gambino to one of his top hitmen, Joseph Colombo. It was a fateful choice. Colombo was ambitious, intelligent, and most importantly, pragmatic. He understood that Bonanno's plot was doomed to failure and would likely result in the destruction of everyone involved. The opportunistic Colombo revealed the plot to its targets. The other bosses quickly realized that Magliocco could not have planned this himself. The commission summoned Magliocco to answer for his role in the conspiracy. Remarkably, they showed mercy, perhaps recognizing that Magliocco had been manipulated by Bonanno. They forced him to step down but spared his life. The commission gave control of the family to Colombo, who had exposed the murder plot. It would now forever be known as the Colombo crime family, and Colombo was the first American-born mafia boss in history. As boss, Colombo brought peace and stability to the broken crime family. Colombo's leadership was never challenged due to his support from Gambino. He developed very strong ties with Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, mostly due to alerting them of the impending murder plot against them. For the first time in years, the family that would bear his name enjoyed a period of relative calm and prosperity. But Joe Colombo was different from previous bosses. Where Profaci and Magliocco had operated in the shadows, content to run their criminal enterprises quietly, Colombo had bigger ambitions. In April 1970, Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, dedicated to fighting discrimination against Italian Americans. Many mobsters disapproved of the League because it brought unwanted public attention to the Cosa Nostra. Colombo ignored their concerns and continued gaining support for his League. He organized rallies, appeared on television, and even picketed FBI headquarters. For a man whose business depended on secrecy, it was a remarkably public stance. Meanwhile, in prison, Crazy Joe Gallo was undergoing his own transformation. He used his sentence as an opportunity to educate himself, reading everything from philosophy to literature. Gallo reportedly became fascinated by revolutionary thinkers and began to see himself as a kind of underworld Che Guevara. He befriended African-American gangster Nicky Barnes while in prison and coached him on taking over Harlem. After leaving prison, Gallo recruited black soldiers into his crew. This was unprecedented in the insular world of Italian-American organized crime, where membership had always been restricted to those of Italian descent. When Gallo was released in 1971, he found a very different family than the one he'd left behind. Colombo was now the boss, holding rallies and making headlines. The old Profaci loyalists who had fought against the Gallos were either dead, in prison, or had made peace with the new order. But Crazy Joe hadn't forgotten the past, and he certainly hadn't forgiven Gambino crime family boss. Carlo Gambino encouraged Gallo to challenge Joseph Colombo's control over the former Profaci family. Gambino had grown tired of Colombo's publicity-seeking and believed the Italian-American Civil Rights League was bad for business. If Gallo could remove Colombo, it would solve multiple problems at once. On June 28, 1971, Colombo was shot while attending a rally for the Italian-American Civil Rights League at New York's Columbus Circle. The shooter was Jerome Johnson, an African-American man widely believed to be one of Gallo's prison recruits. Johnson was immediately shot dead by Colombo's bodyguards, ensuring he would never reveal who had sent him. Colombo remained paralyzed until his death 7 years later. The shooting marked the beginning of the Second Colombo War, though this time it would be shorter and more decisive than the first. The Colombo family, now led by Carmine Persico, who had maneuvered himself into the top position, wanted blood. Persico got a number of Colombo family members to agree to set up Gallo at the first opportunity. That opportunity came on April 7, 1972, when Gallo was spotted at Umberto's clam house in Little Italy. Persico had a team of killers on call for months. When they got the word, 4 shooters showed up at Umberto's and entered through the back door. On April 7, 1972, around 4:30 a.m., Gallo was shot dead at Umberto's clam house while celebrating his 43rd birthday. 4 gunmen burst into the dining room, shooting at Gallo. He overturned a table for cover but was hit in the back, elbow, and buttocks. He staggered towards the door before collapsing on the street, dying from his wounds. Gallo's sister Carmela declared over his open coffin that, "The streets are going to run red with blood, Joey." The Colombo family was plunged into a second internecine war until a 1974 agreement allowed Albert Gallo and his remaining crew to join the Genovese family. With the Gallo threat eliminated, Carmine Persico consolidated his power over the Colombo family. Known as the Snake, Persico was a different kind of boss than those who had come before. Where Profaci had been traditional and Colombo had been publicity-hungry, Persico was cunning and ruthless. He understood that in the modern world of organized crime, survival meant adapting to new realities. Persico had faced relentless prosecution that sent him to prison for 10 of the 13 years prior to 1985. Still, he managed to maintain his position as boss while incarcerated, empowering his brother Alphonse and Gennaro Jerry Lang Langella to carry out his orders. The 1980s brought unprecedented pressure on organized crime. The federal government had developed new tools to combat the Mafia, particularly the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO Act. In 1987, Persico and underboss Gennaro Langella were convicted in the Mafia Commission trial and sentenced to 100 years in prison. In the separate Colombo trial, Persico was sentenced to 39 years imprisonment. To run the family in his absence, Persico initially named his brother Alphonse as acting boss. When Alphonse skipped bail on a loan sharking charge, Persico dissolved a 3-man ruling panel and named Victor Little Vic Orena as acting boss until his son, Alphonse Little Alley Boy Persico, could take over. Orena was no slouch. He was well connected with multiple families and had working relationships with John Gotti and the Gambinos. He also had friendships with high-level Lucchese family members like Victor Amuso, who shared the same nickname, Little Vic. Although Persico made it clear Orena was a placeholder, he granted Orena the power to induct new members and order murders on his own authority, powers rarely granted to an acting boss. It was a calculated risk. Persico needed someone strong enough to run the family, but not so ambitious that they would try to take permanent control. Orena was given the right to order murders and induct family members at his choosing. Although Persico gave him a wide berth of power, Orena soon began to resent Persico's authority. He felt Carmine had his day and should retire. In 1990, using his strong ties to Gambino boss John Gotti, Orena petitioned the Mafia Commission to declare him the official boss of the Colombo family. Unwilling to cause more conflict, the commission refused. The other families had learned from experience that succession disputes within families often spilled over into broader conflicts. On June 21, 1991, an enraged Persico sent gunmen under the leadership of Carmen Sessa to murder Orena at his house. However, Orena managed to escape before the gunmen could strike. The Third Colombo War had begun. What followed was the bloodiest internal conflict in the family's history. The family split into factions loyal to Orena and to Persico, and 2 years of mayhem ensued. It ended in 1993 with 12 members of the family dead and Orena imprisoned, leaving Persico the winner. On November 18, 1991, 2 carloads of Orena supporters ambushed Persico Capo Greg Scarpa Sr. in Brooklyn as he drove his daughter and granddaughter home. Hitmen converged on Scarpa's car with guns drawn, but Scarpa, one of the toughest gangsters the mob had ever seen, hit the accelerator and escaped, crashing into anything in his way. Scarpa, who had been diagnosed with AIDS in 1986 after receiving a tainted blood transfusion, entered the fray like a wild man. He had nothing to lose. Interestingly, Scarpa had been a secret FBI informer for 30 years, playing both sides to his own advantage. The war raged through Brooklyn and Long Island, with soldiers choosing sides and settling old scores under the cover of the larger conflict. William Cotolo sent teams that killed Persico loyalists Rosario Nastasa and Vincent Fusaro in December 1991. Scarpa sent a team to kill Orina soldier Joseph Tolino, who escaped, but Genovese family mobster Thomas Amato was accidentally killed. Matteo Speranza, an innocent employee of a shop owned by Persico associates, was murdered by Anthony Liberatore and his father, who were trying to make a name for themselves. The Liberatores later cooperated with the FBI. The violence had spiraled completely out of control, claiming innocent victims and drawing massive law enforcement attention. The war absolutely gutted the family ranks. More than 100 members or associates went to prison, and over a dozen people died. Orina got convicted in a RICO case, so the fight became pointless but continued. The family was kicked off the commission while the war was going on. Authorities cracked down on both sides to end the violence, which had gotten far out of hand. 41 Persico loyalists were sent to prison, as well as Orina and his most powerful capo, Pasquale Patti Amato. On December 22, 1992, Orina was convicted of racketeering and murder charges. He received 3 life sentences plus 85 years in federal prison. By late 1992, the shooting war had petered out, and Persico remained in control of the Colombo family. An internal war waged for about 3 years and left 10 dead. A truce was arranged by the Commission in the mid-1990s, with Persico's cousin, Joseph Russo, becoming interim boss of the now substantially weakened family. The Colombo family had survived, but at a terrible cost. The aftermath of the Third War left the Colombo family a shadow of its former self. Left with a family decimated by war, Persico continued to run the family until his death in prison in 2019, but the organization never recovered. In the 2000s, the family was further weakened by multiple convictions in federal racketeering cases and numerous members becoming government witnesses. One of the war's unfinished pieces of business involved William Wild Bill Cutolo. Wild Bill Cutolo was one of Orina's top guns during the war. After the war, he eventually mended fences within the crime family and was killed on orders of Persico's son, Little Allie Boy, in 1999. Carmine and Allie Boy decided to have Cutolo killed years later. William Cutolo Jr. was devastated over his father's murder and set out to get revenge. When underboss Jackie DeRoss showed up at the Cutolo family residence demanding Wild Bill's loan sharking books and warning them about cooperating, young Cutolo agreed to work with the FBI and wear a wire. He had originally intended to kill Persico and DeRoss until he remembered his father saying he'd rather be dead than in prison for life. The new millennium brought no respite for the battered family. Law enforcement convictions peaked in the 1980s and 90s, but a 21st century spate of arrests landed many current members in prison. In 2011, the arrest of 119 individuals with reputed ties to organized crime, including 34 with alleged connections to the Colombo family, was considered by the FBI to be the single largest action against the mob to that date, many law. Enforcement agencies believe the Colombo crime family to be the weakest of the 5 families of New York City as of 2011. After Persico died in jail in 2019, another cousin, Andy Mush Russo, reputedly took over as boss. He and other leaders, however, were arrested in 2021 on extortion charges, and Russo died in 2022 while awaiting trial. The story of the Colombo crime family is ultimately a tragedy of wasted potential and self-destruction. From its origins as a bootlegging gang in 1920s Brooklyn to its near collapse in the wake of 3 civil wars, the family's history demonstrates the inherent contradictions of organized crime. The very qualities that allowed these men to rise to power, ruthlessness, ambition, and a willingness to use violence, also contained the seeds of their downfall. Each of the family's 3 wars followed a similar pattern. An aging boss would try to maintain control from prison or through designees. Ambitious underlings would see opportunity in the power vacuum. Blood would flow in the streets until exhaustion, law enforcement, or death ended the conflict. And each time, the family emerged weaker than before. The first war, between the Gallos and Profaci, was about money and respect. Young Turks challenging an old boss who demanded too much and gave too little. The second war, sparked by Joe Colombo's shooting, was about revenge and the old codes of honor that demanded blood for blood. But the third war, between Persico and Orina, was perhaps the most senseless of all, a battle between 2 factions for control of an empire that was already crumbling. What makes the Colombo family story particularly poignant is how unnecessary much of the violence was. Time and again, conflicts that could have been resolved through negotiation or compromise instead erupted into shooting wars that decimated the family's ranks and brought intense law enforcement scrutiny. The family that Joseph Profaci built with such care in the 1920s had, by the 1990s, essentially destroyed itself. The role of law enforcement in the family's decline cannot be understated. The RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s didn't just remove individual mobsters from the streets. They disrupted the entire structure of organized crime. Bosses trying to run families from federal prisons, acting bosses with unclear authority, and constant surveillance made the old ways of doing business impossible. But perhaps the most devastating blow to the Colombo family wasn't bullets or indictments. It was betrayal. Numerous members became government witnesses. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence that had protected the Mafia for generations, crumbled in the face of lengthy prison sentences. Former soldiers and even capos took the stand against their old associates, trading secrets for reduced sentences or placement in witness protection. The generational divide that first manifested in the Gallo Revolt of the 1960s never truly healed. Old-timers who had learned their trade in the shadows of prohibition could never fully understand or trust the younger generation that had grown up in a different America. The younger mobsters, in turn, resented being bound by old-world traditions that seemed increasingly irrelevant in modern New York. Today, the Colombo crime family still exists, at least on paper. There are still ceremonies and basement clubs where new members swear ancient oaths and prick their fingers to seal their loyalty in blood. There are still crews running illegal gambling operations and loan-sharking rings. But the family that once commanded fear and respect throughout New York is now barely a shadow of what it was. The neighborhoods have changed too. The old Italian enclaves of Brooklyn, where the family was born and thrived, have given way to gentrification. The social clubs where mobsters once plotted murders over espresso have become artisanal coffee shops. The waterfronts that the family once controlled are now lined with luxury condominiums. The world that created and sustained the Colombo crime family no longer exists. In the end, the story of the Colombo crime family is a cautionary tale about the price of power obtained through violence. Every boss who took the throne did so over the bodies of rivals. Every period of peace was merely the calm between storms. Every victory contained within it the seeds of future defeat. From Joseph Profaci, who built an empire on bootlegged liquor and demanded tribute until his men revolted, to Carmine Persico, who died in federal prison still trying to control a family he hadn't seen in decades. The history of the Colombo crime family is written in blood. It's a history of fathers and sons, of loyalty and betrayal, of old-world traditions clashing with new-world ambitions. The 3 wars that tore the family apart were, in many ways, inevitable. An organization built on violence and greed, held together only by fear and tradition, cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Each generation must either submit to the old ways or fight to change them, and in the Colombo family, they chose to fight. The cost was everything. Perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire saga is not any individual mobster, but the family itself. What began as Joseph Profaci's American dream building something from nothing, providing for his people, establishing a legacy, became a nightmare of fratricidal violence that consumed generations. The olive oil king's empire became a kingdom of ashes. Looking back at nearly a century of Colombo family history, one is struck by the waste of it all. The intelligence and organizational skills that built a criminal empire could have built legitimate businesses. The loyalty that bound men together in crime could have bound them in lawful enterprise. The courage that was displayed in street battles could have been channeled into honest work. But that's not the choice they made. Instead, they chose the life, la cosa nostra, this thing of ours, and it consumed them. From the bootleggers of the 1920s to the racketeers of today, each generation has paid the price for that choice in blood, prison time, and broken families. The emotional truth at the heart of the Colombo crime family story is this: they destroyed the very thing they claimed to value most, family. In their pursuit of power and money, they turned brothers against brothers, fathers against sons. They created widows and orphans in their own neighborhoods. They betrayed the very codes they swore to uphold. Persico continued to run the family until his death in prison in 2019, but the organization has never recovered. Those words could serve as an epitaph not just for Carmine Persico, but for the entire Colombo crime family. They never recovered from the wars they inflicted upon themselves. They never healed from the wounds they opened in their own flesh. In the quiet moments, when the gunfire had ceased and the blood had been washed from the streets, perhaps some of them wondered if it had all been worth it. The money, the power, the respect, purchased at such a terrible price. But by then it was too late. They were trapped in a cycle of violence and revenge that stretched back generations, prisoners of their own history. The story of the Colombo crime family is many things: a crime saga, a family drama, a piece of American history. But above all, it is a tragedy. Not because they were brought down by law enforcement or rival families, but because they brought themselves down. They had everything they claimed to want: power, money, respect, and they destroyed it all with their own hands. As we reach the end of this blood-soaked chronicle, we're left with a profound sense of waste and loss. Not sympathy for criminals, but sadness for what might have been. These were men of talent and ambition, bound together by culture and circumstance, who chose a path that led inevitably to destruction. Their legacy is not the empire they built, but the ruins they left behind, families torn apart, communities terrorized, and a name that will forever be associated with violence and betrayal. The Colombo crime family story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. No climactic shootout, no dramatic last stand. Just old men dying in prison cells, their empire crumbled, their traditions forgotten, their wars meaningless in the end. They fought for control of a thing that was already dying, killed each other for the right to rule over ashes. This is their legacy, a cautionary tale written in blood on the streets of Brooklyn, a reminder that violence begets only violence, that power taken by force must be maintained by force, and that eventually, inevitably, the violence turns inward. The family that was born in bloodshed during Prohibition died by its own hand in the wars that followed, leaving behind only stories of what happens when men choose bullets over brotherhood, when they value power more than peace.